for York West.
Much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak on an important issue that I believe matters to all of us in the House. I will be splitting my time with my colleague from Markham Unionville as well. So now that the weather is nice and all of us are getting out, I have to tell you that this past weekend, when I was out in the riding, I had the opportunity to pass through the area around St. Augustine's Church, an important part of the riding of York West. I also passed 35 Shoreham, 711 Arletta, and 415 Driftwood, all places that exhibit a tremendous sense of community and neighborhood pride. But these places are similar for more than just their community spirit. They are buildings owned and managed by Toronto Housing, and they are all places in which residents are worried. You see, the residents of these buildings are hard-working families that are struggling just to make ends meet. In fact, even with the subsidized portion of the rent, many of these residents are spending as much as 85% of their income on rent alone, leaving just pennies for food, clothing, transportation, medicine, and other essentials. For many of the tenants living at 2350 Finch or 2765 Islington, the dream of home ownership has crumbled at their feet under the weight of inescapable daily struggles just to survive, a vicious and punishing cycle of poverty. You see, in the past, the concept of personal home ownership was a near guarantee. All that one needed to do was work hard for a decent wage, and the rest was possible. But sadly, for many low-income families in my riding and across Canada, including working families, that promise is now a faint remembrance of a decent and distant dream. In 1980, the average cost of a detached home was roughly $100,000. The average Canadian made about $41,000 a year, which meant there was room for a mortgage, transportation, groceries, and the other essentials that come out of a paycheck. But today, the average detached home costs more than double what it did just 30 years ago. And in Toronto, the average home price now hovers around $1 million. Despite the spike in costs, the average Canadian still makes about $41,000 a year. I'd also like to point out that many working families in my riding make far less than $41,000, which only intensifies the problems they face when it comes to housing. Some are forced, as I said, to pay 85% of their income in rent. Clearly, this is not a tenable position, and the fact that this government is intentionally allowing more and more housing cooperatives operating agreements to expire is only making issues worse. This government's decision to scale back public funding to social housing is reckless, and it is, in effect, leaving low-income families out on the street. Families living in these units know that there is a housing crisis, and they need to understand why. But of course, we know the housing crisis has hit because the NDP clearly torpedoed both the Liberals' national housing strategy and the current Premier's provincial housing program. Worse yet, Tim Hudak is mimicking the inaction of his federal cousins with his pink slip promise. That really unnerves an awful lot of people in my riding. Put another way, the Conservatives have done nothing to lower or manage housing costs, and they are doing nothing less to help fix the income situations of our middle-class families face. For example, rather than work to create jobs, Tim Hudak has promised to fire 100,000 Ontario workers. I call it his pink slip promise, and it pulls back the veil on the Conservative ideology when it comes to social programming of all sorts. The NDP, despite tough-sounding talk, torpedoed both the Liberals' national housing strategy and Kathleen Wynne's housing program in the most recent Ontario budget. Of course, they also voted against a new pension plan for low-income workers as well. So it seems that 3 million working Ontarians who do not have an employer-sponsored pension just had the rug pulled out from under them by an NDP lusting for power. Interesting to note that this is the same group that were punished when the NDP smashed the federal daycare and early learning strategy. So it seems like there's a trend developing there.
I'll see.
So when Andrea, Tim, and their federal counterparts fiddle, middle-class Canadian families are feeling the burn. Canadians need a means to ensure their own future, and it is our duty to help give them that and what that means. This does not mean handouts, but it does mean ensuring that the systems and structures necessary are in place to again help make the dream, pride, and freedom of home ownership a reality.
Right on.
This government needs to ensure that hardworking Canadians will be building their own futures and not that of the person who is holding the purse strings. So for my part, yesterday I met with representatives of the Canadian and Toronto real estate boards, as many of you in the House have done. We talked about the fact that given more Canadians now renting properties, the disproportionate cost of housing has created a trap, forcing Canadians into a cycle of working hard for weeks just to scrape by. We talked about programs such as the Home Buyers Plan, how it was positive but limited to those who have the resources to put into vehicles such as RRSPs. And we also talked about the need for innovative programs such as rent-to-own and government-regulated reverse mortgages that might allow people to both secure and remain in adequate housing. There was a clear consensus that many working families become trapped in a cycle of high rent payments and are unable to set aside the funds needed for a down payment on a home of their own. This limits their options and prevents them from building equity in their home, from leveraging assets for debt reduction, and prevents them from experiencing the pride of ownership. All in all, without some kind of a national housing strategy, or better yet, a national housing action plan, my constituents living in the San Romano Way community or in the Yorkwoods Village will not have the opportunities they truly deserve and desire. Knowing all of this, it seems almost inconceivable that this government will sit idle and allow billions of dollars of funding for social housing simply to dry up. So I'm glad to see that the NDP have come back to the table that they once abandoned in favor of the Liberal stand in support of social housing and opportunities for personal home ownership. But I would like to see the government do more.
You're here.
I'd like to see this Prime Minister launch a national housing strategy for the low-income seniors, students, and families that worry about having a roof over their head. So allow me to recap and sum up before my time is done. As of last year, rent in Toronto for all types of housing was the highest of anywhere in Ontario. 2, home prices in all regions continue to rise faster than income has over the past 30 years. 3, while the City of Toronto is the largest landlord in North America, it cannot act alone to improve housing conditions because it cannot put the leverage of the equity of its housing units for repair. Number 4, the biggest problem for many Canadians is the down payment for their home. So what does all this mean? It means that many hard-working constituents in my ridings and in ridings all across Canada, in every part of it, have come to accept that home ownership is becoming nothing more than a dream. As parliamentarians living and working in one of our planet's wealthiest nations, we need to redouble our efforts to overcome the problems associated with social housing. Is the government prepared to commit to renewing the rent-geared-to-income housing model so that we provide real security and avoid making the housing crisis worse? Is the government prepared to renew the partnership with the Cooperative Housing Federation? Remember, we are not on the brink of a housing crisis. We are in a housing crisis.
Right.
We must also remember that social housing solutions may lead to solutions to other problems on the national agenda. We need student housing to reduce student debt. Supportive housing will reduce health care costs, and new and adequate housing for rural, Aboriginal, and First Nations communities is a way to honor our existing committees. Public housing is more than just a place to live. Public housing programs should provide opportunities to residents and their families. As a Liberal, I am pleased to support this motion today, and I hope it will provide the impetus needed to put affordable housing solutions back on track for a national action plan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments?